Eickelberg was a student at information technology at TU Dortmund University. He graduated with distinction as the best student. Since 2011, he has been a research associate at the Communication Technology Institute at the TU Dortmund University Research. His interests are visual fatigue and stereo 3D, eye tracking, and image processing in general.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to my presentation on the perception of dynamic horizontal image translation. Let me start you off with a short presentation outline. At first, I will motivate this work and especially describing the horizontal image translation. Afterwards, I will be describing an experiment where we analyzed the properties of the perception of dynamic horizontal image translation. Afterwards, I will describe our gaze-adaptive approach, which utilizes an eye tracker, and this approach will be analyzed in the second and third experiment. And as you can see, I have a lot to talk about, so I will be concentrating on the results rather than the specific experimental setups. So we've already heard a lot about this accommodation vergence conflict. It is known to be the main source of visual fatigue in stereo 3D. And the solution is generally to place the whole scene in a zone of comfort. And this is done by two steps. On the one hand, limiting the scene depth on the recording side of things. And the second step is the horizontal image translation, to place it in the Z direction. So how does this work, this horizontal image translation? Here we have displayed a rectangle in the display plane and a circle in front of the display plane with a certain crossed disparity. Now we simply shift the views in opposite directions by this crossed disparity, and now the circle is contained in the display plane, whereas the rectangle is behind it. There is also a dynamic form of the horizontal image translation, the DHIT, and it is known in many applications. One example is the active depth cut displayed here, and this active depth cut can, for example, be used to eliminate depth discontinuities between scene cuts. But there is little research how this dynamic horizontal image translation is actually perceived. And well, we really don't know how fast we can actually shift the views. So in order to find out, we carried out an experiment. Here's the experimental setup. And with this experiment, we want to investigate the determining factors of the perception of the dynamic horizontal image translation. We want to know when is the horizontal image translation perceivable and when is it annoying. And we hypothesize that there are certain parameters influencing the perception. The main parameter is obviously the horizontal image translation speed as applied to each view. And we also hypothesize that the disparity budget might influence it and the total amount of shift we apply to the views. So we had 4 still scenes in this test. We used still scenes because we consider this the worst case scenario as far as the detection of the DHIT is concerned. And the DHIT was designed in a very artificial way in this experiment. We simply shift the scene back and forth cyclically over one of 3 defined shift ranges, and the user will adjust the shift speed. The shift speed starts at a very high speed, and then the user lowers the speed until it is not perceived annoying anymore. Then the user will lower the speed even further until it is not perceived anymore. So here are the results. We calculated the mean opinion scores for every condition. And here are the perception thresholds in blue and the annoyance thresholds in red over the disparity budget and for each shift range. So, as we can see, the annoyance thresholds and the perception thresholds are clearly correlated, but there was no apparent correlation between the disparity budget or the shift range. We measured average perception thresholds of 0.14 degrees per second and 0.23 degrees per second as the annoyance threshold. As we can see here, the confidence intervals for some sequences even reach down to 0.18 degrees per second. So we recommend to keep the HIT speed way below this value. However, there's a certain problem in that the perception of the DHIT is very individual. Here we have calculated the perception and annoyance thresholds for each subject separately. Once again, we see the strong correlation between the perception and the annoyance threshold, but we also observe these strong individual differences. For example, this guy over here was annoyed by speeds as low as 0.08 degrees per second, whereas this guy here couldn't care less. So this is a very critical finding because a stereographer designing a DHIT for some movie might just be one of these guys. So the audience might get annoyed by the DHIT he chose. So let me describe our approach now. It is called Ghek 3D. And problems occur as far as visual fatigue is concerned when there are points far in front or behind the display plane. So our idea is to simply analyze where the subject is looking and then shift these points slowly back into the display plane using the DHIT. The processing steps are displayed here on the right. At first, we have the visual focus estimation, where we simply utilize an eye tracker to estimate this visual focus. Then we want to do the horizontal image translation. As I said before, we need to know the disparity of the point we are currently looking at. So in order to do that, we estimate the small disparity map for a region of interest centered around the visual focus. And then through some sophisticated processing, we find a candidate that might be the possible disparity. So with that information found, we could theoretically directly perform this horizontal image translation, but as we found out in experiment 1, speed has to be limited. So in this step, we limit the horizontal image translation speed. Oh, no, in this step, obviously. And finally, the horizontal image translation is carried out. So, there are obviously some questions, mainly, does this kind of processing affect the perception and annoyance thresholds? Are they in any way altered? And first and foremost, does it actually improve visual discomfort? Or, yes, visual comfort. So, here we have our second experiment. In the first experiment, we had a really artificial design of the dynamic horizontal image translation, whereas now we aim to design it in a more application-oriented way and also investigate the properties of the gaze-adaptive approach. The general idea is that that interesting scene contents are brought into the display plane using the DHIT at different speeds. So we had 25 test images in this case, and they were presented under 3 different conditions. The first condition is the Ghek 3D condition, namely our approach. However, we did not use an eye tracker at this stage. Instead, we presented a stereoscopic pointer at a series of interesting locations, and these locations would converge to the display plane using the DHIT. And, well, the subjects were asked to track this pointer with their eyes. And we chose to go this way, emulating the eye tracking, because we need to ensure that all subjects are presented with the same sequence to make the results comparable here. So the second condition is the movie condition. We use the same sequence of DHIT as in the first experiment, but the pointer is not visible. The subjects are allowed to explore the screen freely. Now you might say that this pointer could pose a distraction that influences the results. In order to prove that that is not the case, we also introduced a third condition, the control condition, where a pointer was shown, but the pointer locations did not actually converge. So this is the same as, basically the same as the movie condition, in that the eyes and the convergence is not synchronized. Since this test is non-interactive, we used the standard single stimulus impairment scale method, and the impairment scale is displayed here on the right. So let's have a look at the results. We have the mean opinion scores plotted over the maximum DHIT speed here. And as we can see, the movie and control condition are approximately the same, whereas the Ghek 3D condition here exhibits a much shallower tilt. And we conclude that gaze adaptivity reduces HIT sensitivity. Now let's compare the results to those of experiment 1. We are interested in the perception threshold and the annoyance threshold. Looking at the rating scale here again, there is the transition from imperceptible to perceptible but not annoying. This is exactly the perception threshold, and the next step is the annoyance threshold. So looking up the scores, we see that the perception thresholds remain largely unchanged, but the annoyance thresholds without gaze adaptivity is increased to 0.35 degrees per second. We believe that this difference is due to the more sporadic nature of the DHIT in this experiment. With gaze adaptivity, the annoyance threshold was even further increased to 0.5 degrees per second. And we conclude that gaze adaptivity does reduce the DHIT annoyance. So let's have a look at the third experiment. We finally want to evaluate whether visual comfort is actually improved by this approach. And in this case, we showed 6 motion sequences in 3 conditions. And they were presented under the condition raw, which means that the sequences were shown as they are, no processing applied at all. Then we have the ZPS condition, which stands for zero parallax setting, a term you might all know. And here, a presumably good stationary HIT was chosen and was presented to the subjects. Lastly, we finally evaluated the full prototype using an eye tracker, which is displayed here, and had the subjects look at the sequence in this way. We used a simple pair comparison method and combined it with a simple preference judgment where you could just say sequence A is better, sequence B is better, or they are equally comfortable. We chose this simple preference scale because the differences between the conditions are really very subtle, as we will see on the next slide as well. Here we have plotted the mean opinion scores. Let me explain the graphs a little bit. Here we compared Ghek 3D versus the raw condition, where a score of 1 corresponds to Ghek 3D is better, and a score of -1 corresponds to the raw condition is better. And apparently, in none of these condition combinations, no distinct tendency could be observed. And we were wondering, why is that? So we had a look at the statistics, and we found that the standard deviations are very high. And if you see that here, 0.4 to 0.8 is pretty high, seeing that the maximum value is 1. So furthermore, no subject exhibited any clear systematic preferences for any condition. Equally comfortable was picked in was picked most often in almost all stimuli, and in interviews conducted directly after the test, most subjects hinted stuff like that it would look all the same. Although all of them affirmed a strong visual discomfort for anchor sequences shown before the test. So we conclude that visual discomfort is not induced by any condition for short stimuli. We also had to look at visual attention since we had the eye tracker running anyway. So here we have two example frames displayed, and we observed that Ghek's 3D actually degenerates to an almost stationary horizontal image translation in presence of strong visual attractors, as we can see here. The heat maps are overlaid, and most subjects would only look at the head or the hands. So this makes Ghek's 3D degenerate, as noted, and due to that, most of the sequences were actually placed right in the zone of comfort, which might explain why we could not observe a serious gain as far as the visual comfort is concerned. So let me conclude this work. I described an approach for gaze-adaptive horizontal image translation, which utilizes a CUDA-enhanced region of interest disparity map estimation. And I described the results of 3 experiments. We found out that the perception of the dynamic horizontal image translation is independent of disparity budget and shift range, and that there are strong individual differences. The perception threshold was 0.14 degrees per second, and the annoyance threshold was increased to 0.35 degrees per second in regular watching conditions. With gaze adaptivity, it was increased even further to 0.5 degrees per second. And because of the individual differences, we recommend to keep the DHIT speed way below 0.12 degrees per second. Ghek's 3D does not affect visual discomfort for short stimuli, as we have seen just a few seconds ago. However, this does not necessarily mean that it does not work, because most symptoms of visual discomfort only aggregate over prolonged viewing sessions. So in the future, we would like to investigate this approach after prolonged viewing sessions. And furthermore, due to the horizontal image translation, there's a certain distortion of depth. This distortion can be compensated for by adjusting the camera baseline, and this can be done through depth image-based rendering, like we've heard yesterday already. So, thank you for your attention.